Actually, I was thinking about it while we were singing, and Pass It On actually comes from the 70s. And so it's been used by youth groups and others for longer than some of us have been alive. So still a good song. And it points us to the love of God. And I want us to keep that theme of God's love always in the back of our minds as we turn our attention to what is a difficult topic. Divorce has been a topic of significant interest in academic institutions, political institutions, other places over the last century or more, as divorce laws have liberalized in terms of who can divorce and why they can divorce. Divorce has also become a point of significant controversy in churches. Now, perhaps it is less so today than it was maybe 25 years ago. But that's only because we've layered on top of this controversy others to go with it. But in all of the hand-wringing and speech-making, sometimes we forget that there are real people involved. That in the United States, millions of couples have had their lives ruined by divorce. And millions of children have been wounded by the fact that their parents couldn't keep their family together. Over the next 4 weeks, I said 3 last Sunday, it's going to be 4. Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to take a really close look at Jesus' teaching on divorce. For the first couple of weeks, we're going to really lay a biblical foundation for that teaching. And then we're going to look at the teaching itself. And then finally, we're going to apply that teaching to our own lives. But one of the things that I want us to hear in all of that is that the teaching that Jesus provides is, once again, an act of divine love. It is God trying to help the people that He has created and that He loves understand their own brokenness and come to terms with it in a way that helps everybody. That's what this is all about. It's not about condemnation. It's not about somebody standing up and wagging their finger at you, telling you that you are a bad dog. It is Christ giving us direction. Now, this morning, we want to begin where Jesus began. We want to do what He did, and that's look back at the Old Testament. We want to see the theological and anthropological and social foundations that Jesus lays, the legal foundations that Jesus is building upon, foundations that were laid by the Old Testament itself. Now, what we're going to do as we do that is we're going to engage 3 questions, and the outline will help you see these 3 questions. Now, what are these 3 questions? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean that God created us as sexual beings? And how does marriage contribute to the practice of human sexuality? Now, we're only going to deal with one of those questions today, because as I was working through this sermon on the treadmill this week, I realized it was too long. Yes. More accurately, Natalia realized it was too long. So we're going to take this first question today, all right? But if you're looking at the outline there, you're thinking, well, it looks like there's plenty of material there, and there is. So let's turn our hearts to this first question. What does it mean to be human? And you'll see as we put that slide up that I've got Genesis 1:26 through 28 on the screen here for you. We're going to be thinking a lot about these three verses from Genesis 1, and then Genesis 2:18 through 25. We're going to be thinking a lot about those because these are the texts that Jesus himself cites. But they are also foundational to our own understanding of the Old Testament's teaching and what the New Testament does as it unfolds this grand story of God's redemption of his people. So, as we think about Genesis 1, what are some models that people have used to answer our question? What does it mean to be human? Because you see, John Calvin was right. You won't hear me say that very often, but John Calvin was right. If we don't understand God and we don't understand ourselves, we really don't understand anything. And really, that goes all the way back, even beyond Calvin, even beyond Jesus, to the Greek philosophical tradition. The Greek philosophers asked three questions. Well, they asked more than that, but there are at least three that are foundational. Who is God? Who am I? And what is the good life, or what is the moral life? And so we're asking this question, what does it mean to be human? Now, of course, if you are answering that question from the standpoint of sort of humanistic naturalism, then you might posit that humans are really just biochemical machines. We're just functioning entities. We don't have any real meaning or purpose. You see, that is the real problem with evolutionary theory, especially as it was practiced in the late 19th, all the way through, well, basically the late 20th century. It wasn't that people proposed that life on Earth evolved over time. The truth is, if you read Genesis 1, you can make it fit that model. Okay, people have. That's not the real issue. The real issue was always the assumption that there is nothing behind that process. It was the assumption that we as humans are mere products of natural processes. Processes that have no guiding mind, that have no beating heart of love. That empties human life of its meaning and its dignity. Another model proposed by 20th century psychology is that humans are sort of self-actualization machines, that really humans are about self-actualizing. Now, some of you have studied Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. One of the things that I think a lot of psychologists would say today is it just doesn't work that way. Those needs are all needs, but you don't sort of pursue them in a mechanistic order. Yes, you need food and shelter, but you also need security at the same time. And just because you don't have food or security doesn't mean you're not also going to be looking for companionship, for social alignment. In fact, those needs can interlock with one another and intensify one another. But one of the things that Maslow talked about was at the top of his hierarchy was self-actualization. Now, if you know what Maslow actually meant by that, then you're better off than I am, because I've studied that hierarchy of needs in several different contexts, and I still don't know what he means. But it's really, sort of summarizing it, it is the idea that we become all that we intend to be, or all that we can be. We emerge into this new sense of selfhood. And what's the problem with this perspective? Well, again, okay, maybe it doesn't empty humans of all meaning, but it does direct us almost exclusively inward. Okay? It does direct us to me, myself, and I. Another model comes from Greco-Roman philosophy. What is it that it means to be human? It means that we are rational, moral agents. We are able to think about things rationally, and we are able to make choices. Now, this takes us a significant step further, doesn't it? Because it introduces something into the equation that is more than mere biological functioning or psychological achievement. And as you look at the Greek philosophical tradition, you think, okay, this is way better than what we've been talking about. Okay? And yet, there are problems with the Greek philosophical tradition, one of them being that it reduces what it means to be human to the rational. When in fact, humans are embodied creatures. It's not just about what you do in the left hemisphere of your brain. So much of being human is about what you do with your body and what you do with the right hemisphere of your brain, what the Bible calls your heart. But maybe more importantly, when we look at our text, Genesis 1:26 through 28, when we look at that text, what we see is that humans, what it means to be human, is to be created in the image of God. And even before we explore what that means, we realize sort of instinctively, ooh, that's a big concept. That's going to be very diverse. It's full of possibilities. It is pregnant with meaning. That's the Christian view. And I would add, that's the Jewish view. That is something that our Jewish brothers and sisters and we as Christians contribute to the world. It's this view of humanity as created in the image of God. But if we don't unpack what that phrase means, it can become nothing more than that, just a phrase. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to explore the image of God as a status. And you'll see here that I've put on the screen for you Psalm 8, or a significant portion thereof, verses 3 through 8. And what Psalm 8 is doing, it's not saying anything necessarily that's different than Genesis 1:26 through 28. But here's what it's doing. It's unpacking that. It's not saying something different. It's adding to it. It's making it more visual. It's making it more tactile. We can kind of understand, oh, especially if you were an ancient Israelite shepherd, you would read this psalm and go, oh, I get this. I understand what this is about. And what is it about? Well, from a status point of view, it is about dignity. It is about human dignity. Humans possess a certain dignity. Well, what is dignity? Dignity is intrinsic worth. Notice I didn't say self-worth because you don't generate it yourself. This is not how you feel about yourself. It is a worth that you did not generate and that you cannot destroy. Now you can try, and we'll need to kind of talk about that in a second. You can try, but that's a perversion of what you're supposed to be about as a human. We as humans possess dignity, and dignity elevates an individual's status. It also separates that individual from others. That's what dignity does. And dignity impacts, yes, how we should behave. We should act in ways that are, what's the English word? Dignified. Well, what we're saying is, when we tell somebody, would you just be a little dignified for once? We're saying, would you act in accordance with the dignity that has been conferred upon you? Okay? But remember, that dignity, just like our salvation, is not earned. It's simply something we live into. But the real consequence of dignity is how other people treat us. If we say that a person has dignity, we're not going to treat them like a worn-out shoe, are we? Because they have dignity. They have worth. And that worth doesn't come as just like they don't generate that worth, I don't ascribe that worth to them. That worth is given to them by God. It is an intrinsic possession, and I don't get to take it away from them. Okay? So that's part of what it means to be the image of God, but there's more to it than that. There is how the image of God impacts our psychology. Now, that's not the best word in the world. I couldn't come up with really the right term, but I think this will make sense to you as we move along. Because a lot of the insight comes from psychology, especially from attachment theory. And I'm using philosopher Jeff Holzclaw's sort of rubric, but it's not really a philosophical construct. It is a psychological one. But Genesis 1:26 through 28 adds a significant element to that rubric. Okay? So let's walk through the rubric slowly and carefully. Make sure we understand what's going on. Okay? And all of this is biblical. You just have to kind of have eyes to see what's going on in the whole biblical story. And the first aspect, the first function of the human mind that makes us truly human is intimacy. It is the capacity to experience intimacy. Well, what is intimacy? Intimacy is emotional closeness. It is the ability to bond with another person. Now, sometimes that closeness also comes physically, and that bonding will take place physically. Okay? But where we're really driving at, what we're really pointing to, is this capacity for emotional and physical closeness. Now, that intimacy is absolutely vital to human functioning, and we've talked about why that is before when we've talked about psychologist and theologian Jim Wilder. Intimacy, bonding, provides us with euphoria, what we call joy. And that euphoria, that joy, it's not always present, but it's always something that impacts the functioning of our mind. Because if you experience enough joy in your life, that gives you not only sort of a guiding compass for how your life should function, okay? Remember, joy is the motivational system that our minds are made to work on. But joy also gives you the strength to endure hardships, to endure emotional distress. But that's not all that intimacy does. Intimacy also gives us the capacity for rest, or we might say peace. Okay? Humans rest best in the presence of another. We even see that all the way back to Proverbs. Humans rest best in the presence of another. And what's happening when we have that kind of rest, when we have that kind of peace, we are able to let down our guard and just be who we are. Just this week, I was listening to a podcast where Russell Moore was interviewing New York Times bestselling author Nancy French. And she was talking about her husband, David. And even just hearing the podcast, you could hear in her voice the admiration, the respect, love almost sounds trite if you use that word. So, even Russell Moore was trying to describe what it was that was just shining out of her eyes. But part of it was the ability for David to be a 12-year-old boy, even though he's a 50-year-old man. The ability to just be a little goofy sometimes, a little fun sometimes. And the only way that happens is because she smiles and just shakes her head and laughs. He knows that he can be himself, that he can relax, that he can be, dare we say it, vulnerable. Now, if your mind is thinking ahead to marriage, you should be. Okay? Because many of the greatest joys of marriage are related to intimacy. And many of the greatest failings of our marriages are also related to intimacy, or a lack thereof. But intimacy isn't the only thing going on here in this sort of construct of what it means to be human. There is also agency. Now, agency presupposes something that is absolutely vital to both a Christian anthropology and a Christian cosmology. In other words, it is vital to how Christians view the world. You could even say view the universe, but view the world, and to how Christians view humans. What it means for us to be humans. Okay? And it's this. Even though intimacy is extremely important to how we as humans function, so is agency. And agency, by its very nature, draws boundaries between me and thee. No matter how close, say, Natalia and I become, I am not Natalia and Natalia is not me. There is a boundary between us. We are distinct. And being distinct, we have the capacity for action. We have the capacity to do things, to accomplish things. Indeed, this is why economists like Arthur Brooks at Harvard University define hope in terms of my ability to positively impact the future of myself and my family. He's really talking about the ability to meaningfully exercise agency. Okay? But where Genesis 1:26 through 28 reshapes our view of this rubric is that our agency is not merely exercised as an expression of ourself. This is not expressive individualism, as philosopher Charles Taylor has termed it. That's not what Christianity is. No, that third element is responsibility. Because you see, whereas agency separates me from you, responsibility turns my eyes to a fundamental question. Why? Why should I act? Or you might even change the question and say, how should I act? This is the moral part. This is the part that Greek philosophers would have related to, although it's not exclusively rationalistic. This is where I start asking the questions, what should I do? And of course, I am responsible for myself, right? That's part of this boundary drawing stuff. But I am also responsible for you. That is the part of Christianity that is distinct from some construals of American culture. Now, as de Tocqueville pointed out in the 19th century, American culture and its individualism really only works if we understand this responsibility part. But some people in America have jettisoned that aspect of our humanness. Now, I want you to think about something. What is the core tenet of both Judaism and Christianity? Where does that begin? It begins in the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And then it progresses to Leviticus 19:18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. These are the little breadcrumbs that Jesus picks up, right? And emphasizes. We'll get to that later on in Matthew 22. But what's happening there? Well, what's happening there is I'm recognizing that I am distinct from God. And yet, notice this, as an exercise of my agency, I am pursuing intimacy with God. I am recognizing that I am distinct from my neighbor. Who is my closest neighbor? We'll talk about that next week, but spoiler alert, it's your spouse. So I recognize that I am distinct from my spouse, and yet, as an exercise of my agency, I reach out for intimacy. Not just so that I can be intimate with her, so that I can experience joy and peace in her presence, but part of taking responsibility is providing an emotionally safe environment for her to experience intimacy, for her to experience joy and peace in my presence. Here's just a little aside that's going to point us forward in this whole marriage, divorce, and remarriage discussion. I want to ask you something. And most of what we're doing today is we're teaching, but I'm going to leave teaching, I'm going to leave preaching, I'm going to go straight to meddling. Do you bring out the best in your spouse? Or do you bring out the worst in her or him? If the answer to that question is the latter, you don't just need to look at them, you need to look at you too. Are you providing a place, an atmosphere, where they can live into intimacy, agency, and responsibility in your presence? Or is your home characterized by walking around on eggshells, being afraid, being angry over past hurts, and being fearful of future ones? Now, why did God make us this way? Why are we structured in such a way that we are creatures of dignity, that we pursue intimacy and agency and responsibility? It's because God has a couple of goals in mind. Now, the first is order. Now, I put a compass up here, but an even better illustration would be a map. And maybe a map, especially of Oklahoma City, because apparently Oklahoma City is laid out in perfect grids. Okay? Order. Now, as you well know, the second law of thermodynamics, one of its consequences is that creation tends to degrade, in a sense, towards chaos. And that's good theology, actually, because what we see in the Old Testament is this constant conflict between order and chaos. But why does God prefer order? Why does God put humans in charge of bringing order to His creation? That's a big part of what all that language talks about humans subduing the earth and all of that kind of stuff. That's about bringing order. Why? Because order produces intelligibility. And maybe even more importantly, order is a foundational aspect of producing beauty. As we produce order, as we order things, we are able to arrange them in ways that even heighten their beauty. Yes, there is a sort of natural beauty. There is a certain beauty to the rawness of nature. And yet, ancient observers who had an opportunity to visit Nebuchadnezzar's hanging gardens thought they were the most beautiful thing that they had ever seen. Whenever we are doing art, even if it's just painting a portrait, we are demonstrating our understanding of our subject and presenting that subject hopefully in a light that accentuates their pleasingness. I mean, 80 instruments just playing their own thing is called a cacophony. 80 instruments layered and structured and directed and, yes, disciplined. That's called a symphony. So that's the first thing that God is trying to produce. But the second thing is flourishing. Flourishing for creation and flourishing for us. Now, what does it mean? What are we saying when we're saying flourishing? That's kind of a hoity-toity word, isn't it? It's not one that you use every day when you're talking about cows or banks or car engines, And some people might just boil it down to productivity. But the problem with that is that it makes humans a means to an end. You see, in the ancient world, before Greek philosophy, there was a popular understanding that humans were merely slaves of the gods. That our job was to raise the animals, kill the animals, roast the animals so that the gods could eat them. That's not what the Bible's trying to promote. So while productivity is part of it, notice the blessing that God gives to the first couple is be fruitful and multiply, or really to all of humanity. Be fruitful and multiply. Productivity is only part of the story. What God is calling us to is a life of flourishing, a life of, well, to use Jesus' words, abundance. A life of the positive experience of God's goodness. And really, that's the way to think about this. Flourishing life is a life that experiences the goodness of God. Now, as you can see, this is a really good place to stop because we've already got lots to think about. And we're actually just going to pick up right here next week and keep going with our next question. But I want us to think about, as we close, beauty and goodness. Isn't it great that our God wants these two things, beauty, goodness, to characterize our lives as individuals, our lives as communities, and creation? And I want you to think about this. How is it that marriage can fall so short of that people turn away from it and say, marriage is not an instrument of beauty or of goodness? It's a painful question to reflect upon, but it's a question we can reflect upon because we know what our God wants for us. Let us pray.